Over and above the problem raised in the previous panel, that the position presented by Rashi, that the Tzaraat that affected the houses in which the Bnei Yisrael lived was ultimately an expression of Ribui Hatov, an embedded essence of good, a silver lining from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which was, on the surface it seems, a polar opposite to the position expressed in the Zohar, that the Tzaraat of buildings emanated from the Omek Hara, the depths of negative forces that existed in Eretz Canaan at the time, to the point where the house needed to be destroyed and rebuilt with new materials. In other words, bringing the environment in which the Bnei Yisrael lived to a state of Kedusha. In this panel we will look at what seems to be a flaw in the position of the Zohar. That flaw will be built on two assumptions. Assumption number one was that when God informed the nation that V'natati neget sarat bebeit eretz achuzatechem, that he, God, intended to expose the houses of Eretz Canaan to the neget sarat, that this did not apply to every single building, that every single building needed to be demolished in part or in its entirety to be rebuilt with new building materials. Footnote 16 provides us with three sources upon which this assumption is made. We begin with an observation from the Sefer HaChinuch, who, in his clarification of the Tariag Mitzvot, writes, with respect to the neget sarat of the Bayit, that this infestation was limited to Iktsat Batim, a small percentage of the Jewish home located in Eretz Canaan. In support of the position presented in the Sefer HaChinuch, the Rebbe in the footnote directs us to a pasuk in Dvarim, Perek Vav, in which Moshe Rabbeinu, in his series of 3 addresses to the nation prior to his death, promises that upon their crossing the Jordan River into Eretz Canaan, and in fulfillment of promises made to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they will be provided with houses that are meleim kol tuv. You will find houses full of good things, asher lo mileta, which you did not fill them with. And similarly, cisterns and reservoirs containing water that you did not have to construct, vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant, you will eat and be satisfied. However, Moshe Rabbeinu warns the people, with all this abundance of wealth, guard yourself, be concerned, lest you disconnect the abundance of goodness from the source, namely HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Which brings us to the third point, that it would seem to be somewhat disingenuous and unreasonable that in order to receive the Batim Meleim Kol Tuv, they would first have to demolish every single building. Assumption number 2 was that they were entering a land in which the nation states as a whole lacked a moral compass. This is reflected in Vayikra 18:3, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu informed Moshe Rabbeinu that Kamasa Eretz Mitzrayim Asher Yishavtem Ba Lo Ta'asu, they were not to mimic the practices of the Egyptian people amongst whom they lived, and Ukamasa Eretz Canaan Asher Ani Mevi Etchem Shama Lo Ta'asu. Similarly, the nation was not to adopt and incorporate the actions and the beliefs of the Canaan, that nation state, where they would settle following the exodus from Egypt. To which Rashi comments that compared to all the known nations of the time, the practices of the Egyptians and the Canaanites were the most mekulkalim, the most degenerate, and providentially, v'oto makom sheyoshvo bo Yisrael, and the area in which the Bnei Yisrael had settled in Egypt, namely the land of Goshen, was mekulkal min hakol, was more degenerate from a moral perspective than the rest of Egypt. Which brings us to the Omek Hara position of the Zohar, that since the Canaanites were heavily involved in pagan worship, which generally was supportive of immoral behaviors that trampled upon the rights of others, and consequently sharta bebatehem a ruach tuma, for which, as the Zohar suggests, God brought about a neget sarat that required the demolition and rebuilding of the housing, then theoretically, the thesis that not every dwelling was impacted with a neget sarat, in reality, every house, every dwelling would have required demolition. A situation that is somewhat counterintuitive to the promise made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu that upon their arrival in Eretz Canaan they would be provided with Batim Meleim Kol Tuv Asher Lo Mileta, houses filled to the brim with goodness, not of their doing.